This is my true story. On my 70th birthday, I expected warmth and love from my family, especially my son. But instead of kindness, I received cruelty. My son threw my birthday cake on the floor and laughed in front of everyone. I stood there, shocked, wondering how my own blood could treat me with such disrespect. That night, I sat alone in silence, deciding how I would answer him. What I did next changed our lives forever. Before I share the whole story, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe so my story reaches more people. From the moment my son was born, I knew my life would no longer be about myself. Every breath I took was to make sure he had a better life than I ever did. I worked in factories, in fields, and in every kind of job I could find. I woke before sunrise and returned home long after sunset, with tired hands and aching bones, but always a heart full of purpose. I remember many nights coming home with worn shoes and aching back, yet I never complained, because I wanted to shield him from hardship. My meals were often simple, sometimes skipped altogether, so he could have what he needed. I bought him warm coats in winter, even when I had to wear patched clothes myself. I saved every penny I could, cutting corners wherever possible, just to give him a little more comfort. I wanted him to go to school without worry, to learn without fear, to dream without restraint. Every sacrifice I made, every bit of discomfort I endured, I carried quietly, believing that my love would be enough for him to know how deeply I cared. I thought that years of care, years of selflessness, would shape him into a man who respected those who loved him. Birthdays were never a big celebration for me, but for him, they always were. I remember his first birthday, how I bought a small cake even when money was tight, how I watched him with a smile, even though my stomach ached from hunger. That pattern followed me through the years. My joy came from seeing him happy. I worked extra hours to buy presents he wished for, even if I had to forego something I needed. Every step of his life was guided by the thought that I was doing it all so he would have more. I taught him values of respect and kindness through my actions. I showed him that love was measured in sacrifice, that family meant standing together, no matter how difficult. I believed that these lessons would stay with him forever. But life has a strange way of teaching lessons in return, and sometimes the lesson comes in ways you never expect. I never imagined that my sacrifices could be repaid with ridicule, or that a day meant for joy would turn into a moment of humiliation. That birthday, I thought we would celebrate quietly. I thought we would share smiles, laughter, and gratitude. I thought my son would see the effort I put into keeping us together, the years of work that gave us a roof, food on the table, and clothes on our backs. I was wrong. I learned that respect cannot be assumed, and that love can fade quietly, without warning. For decades, I worked with a heart full of hope that my son would understand the depth of what I gave him. I believed that even in old age, there would be a moment when he would look at me and say, "Father, thank you." I never heard those words. Instead, that birthday night, I heard laughter at my expense, a laughter colder than any winter wind I had endured. That moment changed something deep inside me. It was not just the cake he threw. It was years of patience and sacrifice that he crushed with his laughter. It was the erasure of the respect I thought we shared. I went to bed that night, not just hungry for cake, but hungry for understanding, for the warmth of love I thought was there. I realized then that silence and dignity would be my answer, not words. I decided I would respond in a way that spoke louder than any shouting. I decided that my answer would be my actions. I remembered my life of sacrifice, how every hardship I bore was for him. I remembered the cold winters where I went without, so he could have warmth. I remembered the nights I worked overtime instead of sleeping, so he could have what he wanted. I realized the depth of what had been given to him quietly, without expectation of repayment. And yet, the laughter that night told me my gift had been forgotten. That was the moment I decided my revenge would not be loud or cruel, but precise and quiet. It would be a lesson wrapped in dignity, the kind that would leave a mark without needing to yell. I knew I had the power to take away something he thought was secure, something he never earned. I knew I would not confront him in anger, but I would let truth and consequence be my voice. That night, I sat quietly, thinking of what I could do. My mind went through the years, remembering how each sacrifice had been made quietly, without fanfare. I decided my answer would be quiet too, but it would be final. I chose to use the power I had quietly gathered over the years, the knowledge that I could act without his knowing until the time was right. In the days that followed, I worked silently, contacting my bank, speaking to lawyers, learning what I could legally do. I understood that my position gave me the right to act, and I was determined to act in a way that would speak louder than words. I did not want drama. I did not want anger. I wanted a lesson that would be felt deep within him, without a word spoken. The decision was not easy, but it was necessary. I wanted my answer to be a truth he could never deny. I wanted him to know that disrespect comes with consequences, even when the disrespect comes from one's own child. I would not go to war with anger. I would go to war with quiet justice. And so, I prepared my plan, step by step, quietly and patiently. When the time came, I acted without hesitation. I knew there was no turning back. I transferred control of his bank account to a third party, removing every penny quietly, legally, without confrontation. I made sure that there would be no way to reverse the decision. I watched the process unfold with calm satisfaction, knowing my silence was louder than any argument I could have had. When I told him the next morning, I did not shout. I did not demand an explanation. I simply told him calmly what had been done. The shock on his face was enough. He pleaded, but I said nothing more. My silence said everything I wanted it to. It was a quiet answer to years of pain and disrespect. That moment, I learned something profound. Respect is not given freely. It is earned, and when it is broken, it must be rebuilt carefully or replaced with a lesson. I had given everything to him, and in return, I had received laughter and disregard. My answer was not loud, but it was complete. I erased every penny, not to ruin him, but to remind him that love without respect is a fragile thing. I walked away that day without regret. My dignity remained intact. My peace was restored. I had answered cruelty, not with noise, but with action. My heart was heavy, but my spirit was lighter. I knew that in that moment I had delivered a truth he would not forget, and that was worth more than any words I could have said. Now, as an old man, I tell this story quietly, not out of anger, but out of truth. My son threw my cake and laughed, but I erased every penny quietly, with precision and without malice. I learned that dignity and quiet justice speak louder than words, and I carry that lesson with me always. At first, it came slowly, almost unnoticeable, like the first whisper of a storm that builds quietly before breaking. I did not want to believe it, for I had spent my life believing my son would respect me no matter the years or the trials. But I began to notice small changes. It began in the tone of his voice, a subtle shift I could not ignore. Conversations that once carried warmth now carried sharp edges, clipped words, and hurried dismissals. The laughter we shared at family gatherings became tinged with sarcasm, as though my presence was an inconvenience rather than a blessing. It was not just in words, but in actions, small but deliberate. He began to ignore my advice, even when I spoke from years of experience. Simple questions became answers in passing, without thought or care. My thoughts and concerns seemed to matter less. I found myself speaking into a void where once there had been respect and understanding. It was as if the foundation we built together, brick by brick, had been replaced with walls I could not see, but that kept me apart from him. He began to speak of me differently to others, subtly undermining my years of effort. I heard it through neighbors, overheard whispers, and once or twice direct remarks. There was a certain coldness now, a distancing that carried a weight heavier than any stone. I realized that disrespect was not always loud or obvious. It could be quiet, like a frost creeping over the ground. I began to notice how he avoided my eyes when speaking to me, how he would turn away when I entered the room. It hurt deeply, more than I cared to admit to myself. For decades, I had carried his well-being on my shoulders without complaint. I had given him the best of what I could offer. I thought that such sacrifice would earn a certain measure of respect and gratitude. But instead, I felt a shift, a change in the air that told me that my place in his heart was no longer as it had been. My advice was no longer sought. My presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. There were moments when I wondered if I had failed as a father. Perhaps my sacrifices had been invisible to him. Perhaps he saw them as obligations rather than acts of love. Yet every sacrifice was made quietly, without expectation, out of love that did not demand repayment. That love now seemed to be met with indifference, and in some moments, even disdain. I could not ignore it any longer. I could not pretend that the small, quiet slights did not cut into my heart. One afternoon, during a family meal, I noticed it clearly. He spoke to me in a tone of impatience, cutting short my attempt to share something important to me. His eyes avoided mine, and his body language spoke louder than words. I could feel the disrespect like a physical blow. It was a feeling that stayed with me for days, growing quietly, gnawing at my peace. I began to remember the years, the long hours, the cold nights, and the warm mornings, all spent in the hope of building a life for him that would be worth something. The change was not sudden, but gradual, a slow erosion of respect and love. It was like a wound that grows without notice until one day you realize it is deep and raw. I began to see him treat me not as a father, but as someone beneath him, someone whose opinion no longer mattered. He laughed at my old habits, mocked the care I had given him, and dismissed my presence in ways I could no longer ignore. I began to wonder if the boy I had raised with so much care had grown into a man who had forgotten where he came from. These signs of disrespect became more frequent, and they began to shape the way I saw him. It was not just a matter of hurt, it was a matter of principle. I had taught him values of respect, kindness, and humility. I had hoped those values would carry him through life. Now, I felt the sting of a lesson unlearned. I knew that my silence could not last forever, that there would come a moment when I would have to answer. That moment came unexpectedly, on a day meant for celebration, my birthday. I thought it would be filled with warmth, with laughter, and with the shared joy of family. Instead, it became the stage for the cruelty that had been growing quietly. He threw my cake on the floor and laughed. Not a single word of gratitude, not a single sign of care, just laughter at my expense. The sound was sharper than any blow, colder than any winter wind I had endured. That was the moment I understood fully the depth of the disrespect I had been facing. It was not merely about a cake. It was about years of love met with disregard, years of sacrifice met with indifference. The laughter was a loud proclamation of a change that had crept into our relationship. I felt my heart break in silence, without confrontation, without argument. I knew then that my response would not come in words. It would come in quiet but powerful action. That night, I sat alone, cleaning my thoughts as I cleaned my clothes. The mud of disregard clung to me as surely as the cake had clung to my coat. I remembered the warmth of his childhood, the pride in his eyes at his first steps, his first words, his first successes. And now I faced a reality where those memories were replaced with coldness and mockery. I realized my patience had been mistaken for weakness, my silence for submission. I decided that my response would be deliberate. I would not fight with words or anger. I would answer in a way that spoke louder than any shouting. I knew that I could not undo the disrespect he had shown, but I could teach him something deeper, that respect is earned, not taken for granted, and that actions have consequences. For days, I thought about what that answer should be. I weighed my options quietly, without telling anyone. I thought of his pride, of the life he assumed was secure, and of the power I still held quietly. I realized that I could take away something he valued deeply, something that would teach him without words. I chose to act quietly, to let the lesson speak for itself. I contacted my lawyer and my bank without telling him. I researched, planned, and prepared. My goal was not revenge in the way of harm, but a quiet and precise lesson. I wanted him to understand the weight of disrespect, not in words, but in loss. I worked with patience, letting my plan take shape without haste. I knew this was not a battle to be rushed. When the time came, I acted. Without confrontation, without drama, I transferred control of his bank account to a third party. I removed every penny quietly, legally, without a word to him. I made sure there was no way to reverse what had been done. I acted with calm precision, knowing that the silence after the action would speak volumes. The next morning, I told him simply and calmly what had been done. I did not yell. I did not demand explanations. I let him see the truth in silence. His face turned from disbelief to anger, then to shame. He pleaded, but I said nothing. My silence was my answer, my dignity intact, my lesson delivered. I walked away that day, knowing I had given him something he could not ignore, the consequence of disrespect. I knew that the wound of his laughter would be remembered, but my silence and action would echo longer. I found peace in knowing I had acted not out of anger, but out of truth. I had answered cruelty with dignity. Now, as an old man, I tell this story quietly, not out of bitterness, but as a lesson I carry in my heart. My son threw my cake and laughed, but I erased every penny quietly, with precision and without malice. I learned that respect cannot be assumed, it must be given and earned, and that silence can be the loudest voice of all. The day began like any other, but deep inside I already sensed a shift that no ordinary day could explain. That morning I woke quietly, as I often did, with the sound of birds outside and the faint hum of life stirring in the house. I had no idea that this day would mark a turning point, the moment when all the years of silence, patience, and quiet suffering would break open. I did not yet know it, but my son was preparing a cruelty that would stay with me forever. It started with laughter. Not a warm laughter of joy or connection, but laughter sharp, mocking, and cold. He had planned something I did not expect. I thought perhaps it was a joke, one of those silly moments children play on their parents. But as the morning passed, it became clear it was not a harmless joke. It was a deliberate act of disdain. That day was my birthday, the one day in the year when families gather, when warmth and gratitude are shared. I had always seen birthdays as a quiet celebration of life, an opportunity to be grateful for time together. That morning, my son greeted me without warmth. His eyes carried a glint of mischief and cruelty I could not ignore. He was not smiling in kindness, but with a strange satisfaction that troubled me deeply. I did not understand it then, but now I know he had planned this. I had done nothing that day to provoke him, yet there was in his manner a clear intent to wound. The family gathered in the living room. The table was set, though the decorations felt sparse. I felt my son's eyes on me more than once, a subtle shift that left me uneasy. We exchanged small talk, the kind that does not speak of heart but of obligation. Then came the cake. My wife had baked it with care, a simple cake, adorned with modest decorations, a gesture of love. It was meant to be a moment of warmth, of shared joy. But he had something else in mind. When the moment came to light the candles, I expected smiles, hugs, perhaps a clumsy chorus of birthday wishes. Instead, he stepped forward with a grin that did not reach his eyes. Without warning, he grabbed the cake and hurled it to the ground. There was a sound of splatter, of frosting hitting the floor, of sugar and eggs ruined. The room went still, as if the air itself had stopped breathing. I stared at him, unable to speak. The laughter that followed was worse than the act itself. He laughed not as a boy who had played a prank, but as a man who had planned a cruelty. His voice rang with mockery, echoing in my ears long after the moment had passed. It was a laughter that cut deeper than any physical blow. In that moment, I felt stripped of dignity. My years of care, of sacrifice, of patient love, felt washed away with that cruel laughter. He did not speak of apology. He did not look at me with regret. Instead, he stood there, arms folded, as though what he had done was nothing more than a harmless joke. But the room was silent in disbelief. My wife's face turned pale. My daughter looked away. Even the youngest grandchildren sensed something was wrong, though they could not name it. It was not just disrespect. It was an erasure of all that had been shared between us. I could have stood there and yelled. I could have demanded an explanation. but my silence was my choice. The years had taught me that some wounds are not healed by words, but by actions. I let the moment settle in my chest like a stone. I felt a heavy weight pressing down, not of anger, but of deep sorrow. It was not merely the destruction of a cake, but the destruction of a father's hope, a father's dignity. That night, I sat alone in the quiet of my room. The laughter replayed in my mind, over and over, as though etched into my memory. I thought about the years that had led to this moment. Decades of work, of care, of giving without complaint. I thought about the mornings I rose before dawn to provide for my family, about the nights I went hungry so they could eat. I thought about the sacrifices that no one thanked me for, the silent love that had gone unnoticed. It was not merely disrespect I felt that night. It was betrayal. The cruelty of his act was not in the destruction of the cake, but in what it said about the years between us. It said that my presence, my care, my life's work could be thrown aside without thought. It said that all I had built was not valued. It said that my dignity was something to be mocked rather than cherished. I knew then that silence would not be enough. I knew that I could not walk away without answering. But I also knew that words would not match the depth of what I felt. I needed an act that would speak louder, an act that would carve the lesson deep into his understanding. I needed something deliberate, something precise, something that would mirror the cruelty he had shown me. The next days were filled with quiet planning. I did not speak of it to anyone, not to my wife, not to friends, not even to myself in the early hours of the morning. I knew this response would have to come without drama, without shouting, without the loss of my own dignity. I sought the counsel of a trusted lawyer and quietly explored my options. I discovered something I had not considered before, that I still had control in certain matters of his life, matters that could be quietly altered without his knowledge. It became clear to me that the path to my answer was not through confrontation, but through careful preparation. I thought of the symbolism of my act. He had destroyed something precious to me on my birthday. I would respond by removing something precious to him. It was not about revenge for its own sake, but about teaching him a truth he seemed to have forgotten, that actions have consequences. The weeks that followed were spent in quiet resolve. I did not mention my plan to anyone. I carried on with my days as though nothing had happened, but inside, I was preparing. I gathered the information I needed, arranged the legal processes, and waited for the right moment. I knew that when I acted, it would need to be swift and without warning. When the moment came, I acted with calm precision. I transferred control of his bank account to a trusted third party. I withdrew every penny quietly, legally, without any hint of confrontation. It was an act of quiet justice, an act that mirrored the quiet cruelty he had shown me. I made sure the move was irreversible, that there would be no possibility of turning back. The next morning, I told him simply, no shouting, no pleading, just a quiet statement of fact. He looked at me with disbelief, then with anger, then with shame. He pleaded, tried to explain, to argue, but I said nothing. I let silence speak. The lesson was not in my words, but in the absence of what he once took for granted. In the days that followed, I watched him struggle to understand. His pride was wounded deeper than I could have imagined. Neighbors began to whisper. Friends looked at me differently, some with sympathy, some with judgment. But I felt peace. I had answered cruelty with dignity. I had answered mockery with quiet truth. I had shown, without words, the cost of disrespect. Now, as an old man, I look back on that day with calm. It was a day of cruelty, but also a day of truth. My son threw my cake on the floor and laughed. I could have responded with anger, but I chose a quieter path. I erased every penny from his account, and in doing so, I preserved my peace. That night, after the laughter faded and the silence of my home settled in, I sat alone in my small armchair by the window. The light outside was dim, the kind that comes after sunset when the world begins to soften into night. Inside, the air felt heavy. I did not speak. I did not move much. My mind replayed what had happened earlier, over and over, as though the scene had been recorded and played on a loop inside my head. Every sound of that laughter echoed in my ears like an accusation, a wound that would not heal easily. I thought of the years that had led to this moment, each one a thread in the tapestry of my life with my son. My mind drifted to his childhood, to the days when he was small and full of laughter that was warm, innocent, and loving. I remembered the nights I sat beside his bed, watching him sleep after a day filled with his small victories and dreams. I remembered the mornings I woke before dawn to work, to earn enough to feed him, clothe him, give him a life I thought he deserved. Every sacrifice I had made seemed to return to me now as dust, as if erased in that cruel moment. The cake on the floor became a symbol. It was not the cake itself that wounded me, but what it represented. Years of love, of patient giving, of building a life for him. Birthdays had always been special to me. I had seen them as quiet celebrations of life, of gratitude, of togetherness. I had never imagined that one day my own birthday would become a moment of humiliation. That act, throwing my cake to the ground and laughing, was more than disrespect. It was a rejection of everything I had given him without asking for anything in return. As I sat there in silence, the memory of that laughter pressed deep inside me. It was not a sound of joy. It was a sound of power and dominance, a cruel reminder that he could disregard me without consequence. It was not simply that my cake was gone. It was that my dignity, my years of quiet work, my place in his life, seemed to be cast aside like crumbs. I thought of the many moments when I had given him more than food and shelter. I had given him values, a sense of respect, a foundation of trust, and now those foundations felt shattered. I remembered the mornings when I had woken before the sun to work extra hours so that he could attend school without worry. I remembered the cold nights when I had lain awake, counting pennies, wondering how I could stretch the money for another week so he could have a warm meal. I thought of the years when I had hidden my own hunger, my own tiredness, my own aches, so that he could have comfort. These were not sacrifices I had thought of as burdens. I had done them willingly because that was the nature of fatherhood as I understood it. But that night, all of those memories turned heavy. They became proof that my care had been taken for granted, that my love had been mocked. I thought of the countless times I had offered guidance, the times I had listened without complaint when he came to me with troubles. And yet, he had chosen this moment to mock me, to diminish me, to strip away what little dignity I had left. The cruelty of his laughter was not in the sound itself, but in the meaning it carried, a clear message that I was not worth respect. I thought of my own father then, and how he had taught me that dignity is built quietly, without demand. I wondered whether he had felt the same kind of betrayal when I was young. My thoughts wandered into the meaning of respect, of love, of family. Was it something given freely, or was it earned? That night, I began to realize that respect, once lost, is not easily regained, and that love, if not nurtured, can turn cold and distant. The room was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. I closed my eyes and let the sound carry me deeper into reflection. I thought about the years my son and I had spent together, the laughter that had once been warm and real. I thought about the silence that now filled our home, a silence that was heavy with words unspoken. I realized that I could no longer remain passive. My silence would no longer be my shield. This act of cruelty demanded a response, not with noise or fury, but with deliberate action that carried weight. I thought of the word revenge. It is not a word I had taken lightly. Revenge is a dangerous road, one that can consume the soul. But what I needed was not revenge born of hatred, but a quiet justice, a lesson given without violence. I wanted an act that would speak louder than words, that would carry meaning beyond the moment. I wanted him to understand what he had done, not through argument, but through consequence. That night, I began to form a decision in my mind. It was not an impulse born of anger, but a thought shaped by years of patience and sacrifice. I resolved that my response would be measured, deliberate, and certain. I would not confront him with shouting or pleading. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break under his cruelty. I would respond with quiet precision, an act that would be undeniable in its meaning. The first hours of that night were filled with memories. I thought of the times when I had held him when he was sick, the nights I had stayed awake waiting for him to return safely home, the days I had given without thought for my own rest or comfort. I remembered his laughter as a child, the way his eyes had once shone with trust. And now that laughter was gone, replaced with something sharp and cutting. It was a moment that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. By the time the house was quiet, I had made a plan. I knew I could not speak of it now. The weight of what had happened demanded silence before action. I resolved that my response would not be one of noise, but one of quiet justice. I would take the time to prepare, to ensure that when I acted, it would speak volumes without a single shout. I understood that this was no longer just about a birthday cake. This was about respect, about dignity, about the recognition of a lifetime of sacrifice. As I sat there in the dim light, I realized that silence was no longer enough. The silence I had once offered as patience had become acceptance of cruelty. That could no longer stand. My heart was heavy, but in that heaviness there was clarity. I would answer not with noise, not with bitterness, but with a deliberate act that would speak for itself. I would let my action be my voice, my statement, my truth. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet of the night fill me. I knew the days ahead would require patience, planning, and strength. But I was certain of one thing. I would not let that moment pass without a response. That laughter, that act of cruelty, would not define my story. I would answer in a way that preserved my dignity and taught a lesson he could not ignore. And so I sat there in silence, reflecting, planning, and waiting. The memory of that cruel laughter stayed with me, a constant reminder of why I would act. I knew that my answer would not come tonight, but when it did, it would be quiet, precise, and undeniable. The cake on the floor was more than a moment of disrespect. It was the turning point that would shape what came next in our lives. The morning after that night of silent reflection arrived slowly. I woke with the same heaviness in my chest, the weight of yesterday's laughter still pressing on me. The room was quiet, but my mind was loud with thoughts. I did not rush to speak to my son. I did not move quickly. Instead, I sat quietly in my old chair by the window, letting the pale light of dawn seep into my thoughts. Outside, the world was waking, the sounds of birds and distant voices mingling with the faint hum of life beyond the walls of our home. I kept still. I knew that before I could act, I had to decide. The night before, I had let silence rule, but now the quiet demanded action. My reflection had brought clarity. I could not undo the humiliation, but I could answer it in a way that mattered. I thought of confrontation, of speaking to him directly and demanding an apology. Yet I knew that words alone would not hold weight. They would be heard in the moment, but soon forgotten. What I needed was something lasting, something that would teach him more than words ever could. My decision began to form, not from anger alone, but from a place deep within me. A place where years of sacrifice and patience met the understanding of justice. I wanted to answer his cruelty with something undeniable. I did not want noise. I wanted resolution. I wanted him to know without doubt that the laughter he had thrown at me was met not with equal mockery, but with a quiet action that carried truth. I thought about the nature of decisions. They are not born in haste. They come from stillness, from reflection, from knowing the cost. The cost would not only be mine, but his as well. I knew that whatever I chose now would change the course of both our lives. It would not be a fleeting moment. It would be a turning point. And so, I chose carefully. I considered my options. I could confront him with the pain he had caused. I could demand recognition of my years of giving. But I knew that pride would make him deaf to such words. His laughter was proof that he did not value my voice in that moment. I realized that to make him truly understand, I would have to speak in a language he could not ignore. That language was action. Quiet, deliberate, and irreversible action. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. This decision was not about revenge in the way the world might understand it. It was not about retribution born of anger or spite. It was about justice, about teaching a lesson without raising my voice. It was about preserving my dignity and answering cruelty with something more powerful than words: proof. I knew it would require preparation. A decision this deep and deliberate could not be rushed. I would have to move carefully, without letting my son suspect my intentions. That meant gathering knowledge, understanding my rights, and ensuring that when the moment came, my action would be beyond dispute. I thought of how I had spent years preparing for life, quietly building stability for my family. Now, I would prepare for this moment with the same patience and determination. I made a list in my mind. First, I needed to understand what I could do legally. I knew that my years of sacrifice had given me certain rights, though I had never thought to claim them. Now, those rights became my foundation. Second, I needed to decide the exact form my action would take. It could not be impulsive. It had to be planned so that the meaning was clear. Third, I had to steel myself for the consequences. This decision would change everything. As I sat there in the quiet morning light, I thought about my son's face when he threw the cake, the way his laughter echoed in my ears. I thought about the sting in my heart, the ache in my pride. I knew then that whatever I decided would not be for him, but for myself. It would be a choice to honor my dignity, to reclaim my voice in the only way left to me. I decided I would not speak of my plan until the moment came. Silence had been my shield before, and now it would be my strength. I would let the world carry my quiet preparation until the time was right. This was not about spectacle. It was about precision. It was about making a statement without giving him the satisfaction of knowing my intention beforehand. The thought of confrontation no longer appealed to me. I had learned that loud words can be lost in noise, but deliberate action leaves no room for misunderstanding. It speaks clearly, without distortion, and that is what I wanted: clarity. I wanted him to see the truth of what he had done, without the distraction of argument. I wanted him to feel, deeply, the consequence of his cruelty. I began to plan in detail. My first step would be to consult my lawyer quietly. I had never needed to make such a decision before, but now the moment demanded it. I would ask about my rights, about what I could do to take control in a way that was absolute and irreversible. I knew that the law could be my ally if I acted with care and precision. My second step would be to gather any documents I might need. I would not speak of my plan, but I would prepare quietly, collecting papers, checking accounts, ensuring that when the moment came, my decision could not be challenged. I thought about the years I had spent keeping my affairs in order, and I knew that this moment was no different. Preparation was everything. The third step was to steel myself emotionally. This would not be easy. I knew that the act I was planning would bring its own pain, its own consequence, but I also knew that it was necessary. I thought about the weight of years, about the quiet sacrifices I had made, and I knew that my dignity demanded action. I would not let this moment pass without an answer. I thought about what this decision meant for my son. He might never understand. He might never see the depth of what he had done. But that was not my concern now. My concern was my own peace, my own sense of justice. I decided that I would act not for recognition, but for closure. I would act so that I could look at myself in the mirror without shame. By midday, my decision had hardened into resolve. I would move forward quietly, without drama, without confrontation. I would prepare, I would act, and I would let the consequence speak for itself. I knew that this was not a decision to be taken lightly. It was the culmination of years of patience, sacrifice, and quiet giving. Now it was time for a different kind of giving, the giving of truth. That afternoon, I began to gather the knowledge I needed. I spoke to my lawyer in private, asking about my rights, about the steps I could take to ensure my action was certain and irreversible. I learned that I had legal standing, that there were paths open to me that I had never considered. Each answer confirmed my resolve. I knew now that my decision was not only right, but possible. The more I prepared, the more certain I became that I was on the right path. I did not feel anger in the way the world might expect. I felt a quiet determination, a a steady resolve born of years of living and giving without recognition. My decision was not born of impulse, but of intention. It was shaped by reflection, patience, and a deep understanding of what respect truly meant. That evening, as the house settled into quiet again, I sat in my chair by the window and let the decision rest in my heart. I did not speak of it. I did not move to act yet. I let it sit with me, like a seed planted in the soil of years gone by. I knew that in time it would grow into something clear and undeniable. I was ready to wait, because this decision was not for a moment. It was for a lifetime. I closed my eyes and let the silence speak for me. I knew that when I acted, it would be the quietest and loudest thing I had ever done. My decision was no longer a thought. It had become a promise to myself, a promise to honor my dignity, to answer cruelty with quiet justice, to turn silence into truth. And so, with the weight of that decision settled in my heart, I began to prepare for the moment when I would act. I knew it would not be easy. I knew it would change everything. But I also knew it was the only path that would bring me peace. I decided then and there that I would not speak of my plan again. Silence would be my strength. Preparation would be my shield. And when the time came, my action would speak louder than any words could. That was the decision I made, quiet, deliberate, unyielding. The day I began my action was not marked by noise or anger. There were no words spoken, no dramatic confrontation. It began quietly, with the same stillness I had carried when I made my decision. I woke early, as I often did, but this morning I was not driven by routine alone. I was driven by resolve, the kind of resolve that comes from years of reflection and careful planning. The air was crisp and still, and as I stepped into the small kitchen for my first cup of tea, I felt the weight of what I was about to do settle in my chest. Preparation had been my guide, and now the preparation became action. I did not rush. There was no hurry. I moved slowly, deliberately, understanding that the significance of this moment was measured not in speed, but in precision. I thought of the years I had lived quietly, of the sacrifices made in silence. Now, my silence would be replaced with something far more powerful, a deliberate action that carried meaning. First, I contacted my lawyer again, ensuring that every paper, every signature, every detail was in place. There was no need for explanation, no need for justification. I trusted the quiet strength of legality to carry my cause. The law, I knew, could be both shield and sword, and I intended to wield it with the precision of a craftsman. The phone call was brief, professional, without emotion. The lawyer confirmed the steps were ready, that the work was complete, and that the transfer would be binding. Once the legal groundwork was settled, I turned my attention to the matter itself. I had decided to act quietly, to remove my son's financial privilege without drama, without spectacle. The transaction had to be clean, direct, and irreversible. I thought about the irony of it, that the loudest lesson I could give him would come without noise at all. No shouting, no confrontation, only the weight of truth carried by action. I began the process with steady hands. Each step was carried out with the precision I had planned. I visited the bank quietly, presenting the documents prepared in consultation with my lawyer. There was no conversation, no explanation beyond what was necessary. The bank staff handled the transaction with routine professionalism, unaware of the emotional weight it carried. I remained silent, letting my resolve guide me. As I signed the final papers, I felt a strange calmness. There was no rush, no hesitation. This was not an act of impulsive revenge. It was the culmination of a quiet decision, shaped over days and nights of reflection. I knew the moment was not just about the money or the account. It was about making a statement about dignity, respect, and the cost of cruelty. I left the bank without speaking to anyone further. The transaction was complete. Every penny had been removed, every privilege erased. My son would wake to a world altered without warning. I did not gloat. I did not rejoice loudly. Instead, I carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who has acted with intention. This was not about anger. This was about closure. Returning home, I walked slowly, feeling the weight of the day. The streets were alive with morning bustle, but I moved as if in a private world. My mind replayed the moment when my son had thrown my cake to the ground. I felt the sting again, but not the urge to respond in anger. I felt the certainty that my action would speak far louder than any argument ever could. I knew that the moment of revelation was yet to come. That would be the moment when the truth of my action would be revealed. But for now, I let silence hold me. I knew that rushing to confrontation would undo the power of my decision. Silence had been my strength in the past. It would remain my strength now. I spent the afternoon quietly. There was no celebration in my action, no sense of victory in noise. It was a quiet, deliberate act carried out in the calm of preparation. I thought about the lessons of my life, that dignity is preserved in quiet strength, that revenge is not found in shouting, but in the careful restoration of truth. Evening came, and I remained still. The action was done, and all that remained was the waiting. Waiting for the moment when my son would discover what had been done. Waiting for the truth to speak without my voice. I knew that the impact of my choice would be far greater than any words I could have spoken. In that waiting, I found peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of knowing that I had answered cruelty with justice. That I had acted with intention, without haste, without drama. My action was complete, and with it came a quiet strength I had never known before. As night settled, I sat by the window again. The house was quiet, the day behind me. I thought of my son and the laughter he had shown the day before. I thought of my own years of sacrifice and the quiet decision that had brought me here. I felt no anger now, only the deep calm that comes from acting with certainty. This was the action I had chosen. Quiet, deliberate, complete. It was not for revenge in the way the world might understand it. It was a statement of truth, of dignity, of quiet justice. And as I closed my eyes that night, I knew that I had done what I set out to do. I had answered cruelty, not with noise, but with the quiet power of action. That was my choice. That was my action. That was my truth. The morning after my quiet action, I woke early, as always, with a stillness that felt heavier than the night before. The house was silent, though I knew it would not remain so for long. My mind was not at rest, not entirely. I knew that what I had done would soon reach my son, and when it did, it would change everything. I felt no rush, no eagerness to speak. The revelation would have its own power, without my interference. My role now was to wait, to let truth unfold quietly in its own time. I began my morning routine, as I always did, moving through the motions with calm. I made tea, quietly placing the cup on the table beside the window. The light of dawn spilled gently into the kitchen. I sat there, watching the day begin, as if it were not just another day, but the day when silence would speak louder than my voice ever could. The hours passed slowly. My mind returned again and again to the memory of my son's laughter, so loud and sharp the day before when he threw my cake to the ground. That laughter was still echoing inside me, a sound of disdain that I could not forget. But I also knew my response was not to be loud, not to be immediate. I wanted this revelation to land not as an argument, but as undeniable truth. I moved through the house without haste, preparing for nothing outwardly, but inwardly aware that the moment of revelation was approaching. I thought of my son, of the pride he had shown, of the years I had given, without asking for anything in return. I thought of the value of quiet dignity, and how sometimes silence carries more weight than confrontation. My action the day before had been carried out in silence, and now the revelation would be equally silent until the moment it was spoken. When the time came, I did not seek my son. I allowed him to discover it on his own. I understood that a confrontation would take away the strength of what had been done. The lesson was not mine to speak loudly. It was mine to let be realized by him in its own way. There is a power in absence, in not explaining yourself, in letting the truth speak for itself. That afternoon, I heard him stirring in the house, the sound of movement carrying with it a tension I could almost feel in the air. I sat quietly in my chair, watching him move about. He was unaware that his life had already shifted. That realization had yet to come to him. I stayed silent, letting the day unfold. The quiet of my presence was deliberate, a silent witness to what was about to happen. When he finally came to me, the change in his face was unmistakable. The first sign was the absence of laughter. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than usual, and there was an edge of confusion mixed with unease. I did not look at him directly. I continued with my tea, letting the silence stretch between us. I wanted him to feel the weight of what was coming without my interference. The moment had to be his to discover. He stood there for a long time, words caught somewhere in his throat. I knew then that he was beginning to realize. The tension in his stance was clear, the uncertainty in his voice growing. The revelation was arriving, slowly, without my prompting. There was no anger from me, only quiet stillness. That stillness was part of the revelation. It was the statement that said more than words ever could. When he finally broke the silence, his words were rushed, fragmented. Questions poured out of him like a sudden storm. Questions about accounts, access, privileges. I answered none of them. My silence became my answer. That silence was not emptiness. It was a deliberate presence, a quiet truth that he could not ignore. His confusion deepened, and in that moment I knew the lesson was being learned without my voice. The hours stretched, and the silence grew heavy between us. He moved through the house in a way that was different now. There was no comfort in his movements, no certainty. My quiet presence had shifted the air between us. I could feel it. I could see it. He was beginning to understand the meaning of my action, though not yet the full depth of it. Later, I saw him at the table, papers spread before him, looking through statements, checking balances, and confirming what he had feared. His face changed with every paper he touched. Disbelief, anger, confusion, shame. I did not move closer. I did not speak. I sat in my chair, letting the truth settle around him. The revelation was complete not through my words, but through his discovery. In that silence, I saw a change come over him. The arrogance of the day before was gone, replaced by uncertainty and a quiet humiliation. He looked at me once, a flash of something in his eyes. Perhaps regret, perhaps understanding, perhaps something harder to name. But he did not speak. His silence matched mine, and the weight between us grew heavier still. The evening fell quietly. I prepared my own simple meal, still without speaking. My son moved about the house in a restless silence, the sound of his footsteps echoing softly in the rooms. The revelation had taken hold. The air had shifted. The lesson was complete. My silence, my action, my decision had spoken louder than any confrontation could have. Later that night, I heard him leaving the house quietly. The door closed behind him without ceremony. I remained in my chair, thinking of the day's events, of the quiet justice I had chosen, and of the truth revealed without noise. I felt no satisfaction in revenge, only a calm certainty that what I had done was right for me. The revelation was not just for him, it was for me, a statement that dignity and respect matter more than pride or anger, that actions speak louder than words, that justice can be quiet. And in that quiet, I found peace. The next days brought no explanation from him. He did not speak of the missing funds, nor of the changes I had made. There was only silence. That silence was the continuation of the revelation, a living reminder of what had been taken and what had been given in return, a lesson in respect, a quiet answer to cruelty. As I sat alone in my quiet home, I understood that the revelation had been the final part of my answer. The action was done. The silence remained. The truth was complete. And I carried no regret, only peace. That was my revelation, quiet, deliberate, complete. The day after the revelation was unlike any before. The air in the house was heavier, filled with an unspoken truth that lingered between us. My son moved through the rooms with a stiffness I had not seen before. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and hesitant. The laughter and bravado of the day before were gone. He had been stripped of certainty, stripped of comfort. and now he was left with silence and the weight of his own actions. I watched him carefully from my chair in the living room. I made no movement to approach him. The silence between us had become a living thing, a wall of truth that neither of us could cross. My presence, steady and unyielding, became part of the lesson. It was not spoken in words, but in the quiet dignity of endurance. The fallout of what I had done was beginning to take shape. Neighbors began to notice the change. Whispers started at the fence, in the small gatherings of people who lived nearby. They spoke softly, curious but careful. They spoke of the incident at my birthday and of the silence that followed. They spoke of the quiet resolution that seemed to hang over the house. I did not join in those conversations. I let them happen without comment. The truth would speak for itself. My son became more withdrawn. He stopped speaking freely, stopped making the small jokes and casual remarks he once offered. The pride he once carried seemed replaced by a quiet shadow of doubt. His movements were careful, almost measured. I saw him checking papers more often, as if trying to find a mistake that might undo what had been done. But he found none. My actions had been deliberate, lawful, and irreversible. In the neighborhood, there was a growing awareness of the story, not as it was told by words, but as it was lived. People began to view the act not as mere retaliation, but as a lesson in respect. There were whispers of admiration for the quiet way I had handled it, of a respect that comes from dignity rather than noise. Yet there were also whispers of caution, of warnings about pride and the dangers of silence. I did not respond to any of it. My silence was part of the lesson, as was the fallout that followed. Inside the house, the atmosphere had changed. The air felt different, heavier, as though truth itself had settled there. My son moved in silence, his steps quieter, his presence more subdued. I could feel the tension in the space we shared. It was no longer filled with the warmth of shared moments, but with the weight of unspoken words and the consequences of actions taken. The fallout was not just between us. It was in every corner of the home. The neighbors began to watch more closely. They would glance toward our house when passing, curious about what remained unsaid between father and son. Some came to me quietly, speaking in hushed tones. They asked about the incident, about what had been done, about the reason for the silence. I offered no explanations. My silence was my answer. That was part of the fallout, letting others draw their own conclusions from the quiet dignity of my actions. At home, my son began to retreat inward. His pride, once loud and certain, was now replaced by hesitation. He avoided direct conversation with me. Even when we shared the same space, there was a gap between us, a space filled with the weight of what had happened. I respected that distance, for the fallout was not about forcing a resolution. It was about letting the truth settle, quietly and without interference. The neighbors' whispers grew. Some expressed sympathy for me, recognizing the humiliation I had endured the day before. Others questioned whether my action had been too harsh. But none could deny the change that had come over my son. He was different now. His presence was quieter, his voice softer. The pride that had once defined him had been replaced by a kind of subdued respect, or perhaps a reluctant recognition of what he had lost. Inside the home, there was no argument, no loud confrontation. The fallout was not in words, but in absence. The absence of laughter, the absence of pride, the absence of certainty. My son moved through his days as if carrying an invisible weight, and I moved through mine with quiet resolve, knowing that the lesson had been delivered without shouting, without anger, and without loss of dignity. The fallout was not just between us. It extended outward into the life we shared. Friends began to notice the change. Some spoke to me quietly, offering condolences or support. Others avoided the subject entirely, sensing that the truth was not mine to speak aloud. In every conversation, there was an unspoken awareness that something had shifted irreversibly. My silence had become a powerful presence, part of the fallout that would linger long after the moment itself. My son began to avoid gatherings, to close himself off from conversations. The laughter that had once filled our home was gone. Even meals were quieter, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. The fallout had transformed not just the relationship between father and son, but the entire atmosphere of the home. What had been taken was not just money, but pride, certainty, and the careless laughter that had once been his way of life. I watched him one evening as he sat quietly at the table, papers spread before him, his face drawn in thought. He did not look up when I entered the room. The silence between us was complete. That was the fallout in its purest form, a quiet, enduring change that needed no words. It was a shift in the fabric of our lives, a lesson given and received without noise. The days passed, and the silence remained. My son did not speak of what had been taken. He did not ask for explanation or forgiveness. The fallout was not a single moment, but a slow unfolding, a living reality that shaped every interaction between us. My silence was my statement, and it was enough. The lesson had been delivered, quietly and without fanfare. Outside the home, the story grew. Neighbors spoke softly of the incident, of the quiet way I had answered cruelty, and of the change in my son. Some spoke with admiration, others with caution, but all recognized that something profound had happened. The fallout was no longer just our story. It had become a lesson for others, a quiet demonstration that dignity and respect could outlast anger and noise. Inside, the atmosphere remained heavy. My son moved with a care he had not shown before. His words were measured, his presence subdued. The laughter that had once been his response to life was replaced by a quiet tension. He no longer mocked me or spoke with disdain. The fallout had been complete. The lesson was settled, not in a single confrontation, but in a sustained silence that spoke louder than any words could. I felt no victory in the fallout. There was no joy in the change, only a calm certainty that what had been done was necessary. Respect is not demanded, it is earned, and sometimes the greatest lessons are those learned in silence. My son's silence was the final part of the lesson. He had learned, though perhaps not in the way I had hoped. The fallout was a quiet transformation that would remain between us forever. As the days turned into weeks, the silence became a part of life. We no longer spoke of the incident. The topic was left unaddressed, as if acknowledging it would undo the lesson. The fallout was not in the words we said, but in the absence of words. It was a living truth that shaped our relationship and left a lasting impression on both of us. The neighbors continued to speak quietly of the incident, of the quiet justice I had chosen, and of the change it brought. Some saw it as a lesson in dignity, others as a warning of pride. But all recognized the truth, that the fallout had changed everything. It was no longer about a cake or a bank account. It was about respect, about dignity, and about the quiet power of action without noise. And so, the fallout remained. A quiet truth between father and son, a living lesson in dignity, a transformation born of silence and deliberate choice. The laughter was gone, the pride was altered, and in its place there was a quiet, enduring understanding. That was the fallout, quiet, irreversible, complete. The days following the fallout became a new chapter in my life. There was a strange stillness to the house. The tension between me and my son no longer burned openly, but simmered quietly beneath the surface. I chose not to speak of what had happened, and in that choice lay my peace. Peace is not something found in victory or in revenge. It is something born in stillness, in acceptance, and in letting go. I had learned this slowly, and now I lived it fully. I woke early each morning, before the house stirred. The air was crisp, and the silence was complete. I would sit in my chair by the window, watching the light shift over the garden. The garden was a quiet place of memory for me. It reminded me of the years of work, of seasons past, of patience and endurance. The peace I felt was tied to that quiet work, the kind that is done without noise, without applause, without recognition. My son moved about the house in his own way, quieter now, more measured. There was no longer the arrogance that had filled his voice. I watched him from a distance, understanding that peace is also about giving space. My choice to act quietly, without shouting or confrontation, meant I could leave the house without regret. I could walk away from the moment with my dignity intact. That is what peace meant for me, knowing I had answered cruelty not with bitterness, but with quiet strength. I began to spend more time in the small moments that brought me comfort. Morning tea in silence, tending the garden, reading in my chair, watching the sun rise and set. These moments became my sanctuary. Peace is not a sudden gift. It is cultivated, built over days of acceptance and release. I had cultivated mine in the quiet aftermath of what had happened, in the choice to not speak again of the cake, the laughter, or the bank account. My son and I no longer argued, nor did we laugh together as we once had. Our relationship had shifted entirely, but I no longer sought to reclaim it in the same form. Peace for me meant letting the relationship be what it was now, changed, quiet, and without the need for explanations. The lesson had been given, the fallout had been lived, and peace was what remained. In the quiet of my days, I thought often of what peace meant. I thought of how, in my life, peace had come not from holding on, but from letting go. Letting go of pride, of the need to be understood, of the need to be right. My peace was a gift to myself, given in the knowledge that some battles are won without noise, that true victory lies not in proving a point, but in living without regret. Neighbors noticed my change. There were soft comments, quiet smiles when we crossed paths. They said they could see I had found something different, a calmness in my eyes, a steadiness in my steps. I did not correct them, because peace is not something to be explained. It is something to be lived. My peace was no longer a reaction to cruelty or disrespect. It had become a state of being. I began to spend more time outdoors, walking in the garden, tending the plants I had cared for over the years. Gardening became a meditation, a form of peace in motion. I thought of how peace is not passive. It requires work, patience, and care. Just as a garden needs tending, so too does peace need attention. I tended mine carefully, day by day, in the quiet hours of my life. At night, when the house was still, I sat quietly in my chair. I thought of the years that had led to this point. I thought of the laughter and the pain, of the moments of joy and the moments of loss. Peace, I realized, is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of acceptance. My peace came from accepting the truth of what had happened, without trying to undo it, without demanding restitution. I found peace in the small things, the rustle of leaves in the morning, the smell of fresh tea, the sound of birds at dawn. These things became my sanctuary. They reminded me that life moves on, even after pain, even after betrayal. Peace is a quiet knowing that life continues, and that we have the choice to move forward. My son, too, seemed to find his own version of peace. He no longer sought confrontation, nor did he speak of what had happened. The air between us was heavy with silence, but that silence was no longer filled with anger. It was filled with the quiet understanding that some lessons are learned in stillness. Peace for him, perhaps, was the acceptance of the consequence of his actions. I began to live with more intention. Peace is not something that happens by accident. It is a conscious choice, a decision to let go of the weight of resentment. I chose to walk away from that weight. I chose to carry forward without bitterness. I chose peace. Neighbors began to speak of it quietly. They said they could see I had changed, that the quiet dignity in my steps was proof of something deeper. Peace is not loud. It does not announce itself. It exists quietly as a living testament to endurance, to acceptance, and to the power of stillness. In the quiet of my days, I reflected often on what had been lost and what had been gained. The cake, the laughter, the bank account. These were things of the past. What remained was peace. Peace was not born of revenge or anger, but of acceptance. It was the quiet truth that had settled over my life. I began to write quietly in a notebook, recording my thoughts. Writing became another form of peace, a way to process what had happened and to let it go. In those pages, I found clarity. I wrote of the lessons I had learned, of the power of silence, and of the dignity that comes from walking away without bitterness. My son no longer mocked me, nor did he speak harshly. Our interactions were minimal, but they were filled with an unspoken understanding. Peace is not always about harmony. Sometimes it is about coexistence without conflict. That was what we had achieved. A coexistence built on the quiet acceptance of what had happened. I thought often of the years we had shared, of the laughter and the fights, of the moments of joy and moments of hurt. Peace came in understanding that life is made of these moments, and that holding on to anger only steals the present. I chose to live in the present. I chose peace. I began to spend more time with old friends, sharing quiet conversations over tea. They spoke of their own struggles, of moments when they had chosen peace over pride. I listened quietly, finding in their words a reflection of my own journey. Peace is not a solitary path. It is one that can be understood in the shared experiences of others. Neighbors continued to notice. Some came to me quietly, asking how I had found peace. I told them simply, it comes from letting go. Peace is simple in explanation, but profound in experience. It is not something to be forced, but something to be lived. I began to walk more each morning, letting the world awaken around me. The peace I carried was not loud. It was not something I announced. It was a quiet presence, a part of my being. It was in my steps, my voice, my silence. It was the calm that had replaced the storm. In the quiet of the evenings, I reflected on what I had learned. Peace is not given. It is chosen. It is built slowly, in the aftermath of pain and the acceptance of truth. My peace was born in the silence after the storm, in the stillness after the act of quiet justice. I had no need to speak of it. Peace does not need words. It exists quietly, as a living testament to the strength of endurance and the dignity of letting go. That was the peace I had chosen. And so I walked forward quietly, carrying my peace with me. It was my answer, my lesson, and my gift to myself. Peace is not the absence of pain. It is the presence of acceptance. That was the truth I had learned, and the peace I would carry for the rest of my days. Now, as an old man sitting quietly in my chair by the window, I think back to that day. I think of my birthday, the laughter that turned to cruelty, and the moment I chose silence and action instead of anger. Reflection is not something I do often, but now, in the stillness of my days, it comes naturally. Reflection is the final gift of peace. It is where lessons are learned and truths are quietly understood. I reflect on what it means to be a father who gives everything, who sacrifices without complaint, who loves without asking for repayment. I reflect on how easily respect can slip away, even from those we give our hearts to most. My son once looked to me as a guide, a protector. I gave him years of my life, years of work, love, and quiet sacrifice. I thought he would never forget that. But the cruelty of that day reminded me that respect is fragile. It is something that must be nurtured, or it can vanish in an instant. I think of how I reacted. I did not shout. I did not demand apologies. I did not beg for respect. I acted quietly, deliberately, with a precision born of years of patience. My action was not born of impulse. It was born of a decision to answer cruelty with justice, without raising my voice. In that decision was my peace. In that decision was my dignity. Reflection shows me that revenge is not about shouting back or breaking someone in return. Revenge is about balance. It is about showing the other person what they have lost, without lowering oneself to the level of cruelty. I gave my son a lesson, but I gave it without noise. I gave it quietly, and in that quiet was the power. I did not want to prove I was right. I wanted to prove that dignity lasts longer than anger. I reflect on the meaning of dignity. Dignity is not the absence of harm. It is the presence of self-respect, even in the face of disrespect. Dignity is being able to walk away without bitterness, to act with quiet resolve rather than loud complaint. That is what I carried with me in those days, after my son threw my cake on the floor and laughed. That is what I carried when I erased every penny from his bank account. It was not the money that mattered, it was the lesson, and that lesson was rooted in dignity. I think of my son. I do not think of him with hatred. I think of him with sorrow. Sorrow for what was lost between us, sorrow for the laughter that became cruelty, sorrow for the respect that was taken for granted. I have no desire to rebuild what was broken because I know that some things cannot be rebuilt. Reflection teaches me to accept that truth. I have learned to accept it, quietly, without bitterness. I reflect on the years before that day, years of raising my son, of teaching him what I knew about life, of showing him the value of hard work and patience. I think of the sacrifices made without mention, of the nights spent worrying quietly so he could have a brighter future. Reflection shows me that those years were not wasted, even if their value was not recognized at the time. They shaped me, shaped him, and shaped the lessons we now carry forward. Reflection also teaches me humility. Humility in accepting that no matter how much we give, we cannot control how it is received. I gave my son my life, my love, and my dignity, but I could not make him value them. That was his choice. Reflection allows me to accept that. It allows me to let go of the need to demand recognition. My peace rests in that acceptance. I think of the silence that followed my action. The silence in the house, in the conversations, in the way we moved past each other without words. Silence became my companion. It was not empty. It was full of lessons, full of understanding, full of quiet resolution. Reflection teaches me that silence can be more powerful than words. It can be a language of its own, speaking deeper truths than arguments ever could. I reflect on the lesson I gave my son. It was not in the act of taking away his bank account. It was in the way I did it, quietly, without drama, without noise. That was my way of saying that respect cannot be forced. It must be earned and preserved. I gave him that lesson without raising my voice, without breaking my peace. That was my choice. That was my gift to myself. I think about the days that followed, how I carried my peace quietly, how I rebuilt my life in small, intentional steps. Reflection shows me that peace is not found in one moment. It is built slowly, day by day. It is in the quiet choices we make after the storm has passed. My peace was built in the silence after that day. It was built in the decision to let go, to not fight, to not argue. It was built in the simple choice to live without bitterness. I reflect on what I have learned. I have learned that silence can be a form of strength. I have learned that dignity is more valuable than pride. I have learned that revenge, when it is chosen carefully and quietly, can be a form of justice. And I have learned that peace comes not from victory, but from acceptance. Reflection is how I have come to understand these truths. I think often now of the quiet moments that followed. The mornings spent in my chair by the window, the walks in the garden, the small acts of kindness I found in my own life. Reflection teaches me that these moments are where peace lives. It is not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choices to live well, to let go of what cannot be changed, and to carry forward with dignity. I reflect on the path I have taken since that day, how I have walked quietly through life, carrying my peace as my shield, how I have chosen to let silence speak louder than anger. Reflection shows me that this path has been the right one. It has been the path of quiet justice, of dignity preserved, and of peace attained. I think of the story I now tell, not to prove a point, but to share a lesson. That dignity is worth more than revenge. That silence can be louder than words. That peace is the quiet strength that follows endurance. Reflection shows me that these lessons are what I wish to leave behind. I think of my son, not with anger, but with a quiet hope that he will one day understand, that he will see the value of respect, the cost of cruelty, and the power of silence, that perhaps he will carry these lessons with him in his own life. Reflection teaches me that this hope is enough, that peace comes when we let go of the need for revenge and embrace acceptance instead. Now, as an old man, I tell this story quietly. I tell it not to relive the pain, but to share the truth I have learned. That cruelty can be answered with quiet justice. That disrespect can be answered with dignity. That the deepest peace comes not from proving a point, but from letting go. I reflect on the meaning of it all. My birthday, the laughter, the cruelty, the silence, the act of taking his bank account. It all leads to one truth. Peace is not given. It is chosen. It is built in the stillness after the storm. It is carried quietly in the heart of the one who chooses it. And so, I sit quietly now, reflecting on that day and all that followed. I see it not as an end, but as a beginning. The beginning of a life lived with quiet dignity. A life built on the choice to answer cruelty, not with noise, but with silence and peace. That is the truth I carry. That is the lesson I leave. Final thought. He threw my cake and laughed at my pain. I erased every penny, not to destroy, but to teach. In silence, I found my peace. That peace is my victory and my legacy.